Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch the story unfold. Elian clenched his hands tightly around his old wolf sweater as he looked at his new home, a two-story rundown house with dark brown roof tiles sitting at the end of a small road in the village of Fairview. Bitter cold seeped through the thin window panes, but what made him feel even colder was the man standing next to his mother, Bartholomew. "Elian, come say hello to your stepfather." Helen gently pushed him forward. The 10-year-old boy stood still, feeling a strange shiver when Bartholomew's gaze met his. Black eyes seemed to freeze him in place. He smiled, but it wasn't warm. It wasn't sincere. Something was off. "Hello, stepfather." Elian's voice was so small it almost disappeared into the air. Bartholomew stepped forward, placing his large hand on the boy's shoulder. A slight squeeze, but enough to make him stiffen. "Good boy, we're going to be a happy family, aren't we?" Helen, his mother, beamed. "Of course, we are." "Elian, you have to try to be friendly with your stepfather." Elian nodded, but inside, something was screaming in protest. After moving in with Bartholomew, Elian felt a tension he had never experienced before. Every morning when he woke up, Bartholomew's cold gaze was always watching him, as if no action of Elian's went unnoticed. It felt like an invisible pressure was weighing on his shoulders, making every step in this house difficult. This feeling wasn't caused by the discomfort of the new home, but by the very presence of that man. Bartholomew, though trying to appear friendly and polite, still couldn't hide the actions that made Elian feel uneasy. Once, while Elian was sitting on the sofa, Bartholomew suddenly came over and gently stroked Elian's hair. That touch wasn't the gentle act of a father caring for his child, but a soft stroke, yet full of obsession. It made Elian feel unnerved, as if that large hand could reach out at any moment, touching things worse than that. Elian didn't say anything, but inside, discomfort surged in waves. Even every time Bartholomew stood too close to him, Elian always felt his personal space being invaded, and that made him retreat further into his shell. Bartholomew liked to look at him with deep, dark eyes that were not warm, but full of calculation, as if Elian were an object for him to control. Every time Bartholomew looked at him, Elian felt like the pieces of his life were being torn apart, and something cold was slowly invading his heart. Although Bartholomew always pretended to be friendly in front of Elian's mother, he couldn't understand why Helen didn't see the clear signs. Elian had tried many times to find a reason for Bartholomew's actions, but the more he thought, the more fear and anxiety grew inside him for his own safety. A 10-year-old child like Elian couldn't say anything, couldn't easily face his mother and say that there was a man trying to control his life in an unacceptable way. But he knew that with each passing day, the tension and fear in his heart only became heavier. Every time Bartholomew got close to Elian, he always felt his mental barriers being broken down. That unwanted contact made him feel like he was losing control over his body and mind. Touching him, even though it was the normal action of a father, became something that made Elian feel guilty and scared. Bartholomew's presence was no longer part of the family but a threat, a shadow that couldn't be wiped away from his mind. On the long nights, when Elian tried to sleep in the new room, he could still feel Bartholomew's watchful gaze. The faint light from outside the window filtered into the room, and although Elian had tightly closed his eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing outside the door. That feeling wasn't his imagination, but a real sensation that came from Bartholomew always being close by, sometimes making no sound at all, but Elian could always feel his presence. It was an anxiety that couldn't be dispelled, a darkness in his mind that no light could shine into. Elian didn't dare tell anyone about what he was going through. His mother, Helen, was always busy with her work and never noticed the changes in him. He felt like he was becoming an unexplainable child, unable to explain the growing discomfort and fear within him. His mother always thought Elian simply didn't like change, didn't want to live in a new house with a new man. But Elian knew that what he felt wasn't just rejection. It was an invisible threat that only he could perceive. With each passing day, Elian's fear only grew stronger. He didn't know what to do. didn't know what to say. Faced with Bartholomew, Elian could only remain silent, swallowing all of his emotions and thoughts. But deep down, a strong feeling was forming, a feeling that he couldn't let things continue like this. He couldn't live in a house full of threats and fear. Every night, as darkness gradually enveloped the house, Elian felt an overwhelming sense of anxiety take hold of him. He lay in bed, trying to close his eyes, but could not shake the feeling of unease rising in his chest. Every small noise in the house made him jump. Every shadow made his heart beat faster. But what frightened him the most was the presence of Bartholomew, who he knew would always be there during those quiet moments. Every night, he always felt Bartholomew standing silently by his door, his dark eyes staring in, as if watching every small movement Elian made. This feeling was not imagined. It was something real, as clear as daylight. Although Bartholomew did not speak or move, Elian could feel the weight of his gaze piercing through the door. He tried not to look toward the door, but his eyes couldn't stop searching for that figure, and that feeling only intensified his fear. Whenever Bartholomew was near, even for a moment, Elian felt as though an invisible force was overpowering him. He dared not speak, move, or do anything that might draw Bartholomew's attention. Fear gripped his body, making each breath difficult. And in those moments, Elian felt small and helpless. He could never forget the times when Bartholomew stood by the door, silently watching him. Each time, Elian dared not breathe too loudly, fearing he might do something that would make him noticed. In the darkness, the feeling of being watched was the scariest thing of all. Elian felt like prey, trapped in a snare that had already been set. And although he could not see Bartholomew, he could still feel his presence right in front of him. Then, there were nights when Elian couldn't sleep, the tension in his body keeping his eyes wide open, staring into the darkness. With each passing minute, he felt more and more lost in the cold room. It felt like someone was standing right beside him, and if he exposed the smallest vulnerability, they would pounce and take everything. But what kept him trapped in this fear was his mother, Helen. He couldn't tell her the truth because deep down he didn't believe she would believe him. Elian had tried once, but every time he opened his mouth to speak of what Bartholomew had done, the words seemed to choke in his throat. His mother couldn't understand this feeling. She couldn't see what Elian was going through. Every time he tried to explain, Bartholomew would appear, and just one look or one word from him was enough to make his mother think Elian was just a jealous child, unable to accept the changes in the family. Helen, with her absolute trust in her new husband, couldn't see the obvious changes in Elian. She thought the strange behaviors were just the result of slow adaptation, and she didn't realize that it was Bartholomew who was the cause of all the changes in her son. So, Elian couldn't tell his mother the truth, even though he knew that if he didn't, he wouldn't be able to endure much longer. As each night passed, Elian felt himself sinking further into despair. The feeling of being unable to share this pain with anyone made him feel utterly alone. Sometimes, he wondered if he was just a weak child, unable to face the truth and fight for himself. But when he looked in the mirror, Elian saw that he was no longer an innocent child. He had endured enough, but the fear still kept him silent, fighting alone against the darkness within. The long nights returned again and again, and Elian began to realize that he could only overcome this on his own. Although the fear never left, he understood that if he didn't face the truth, he would never be able to live a free life, never find peace in his soul. Elian couldn't let fear control his life forever. Elian had tried many times to tell his mother about what Bartholomew had done, but every time he was about to speak, a wave of fear would rise within him, preventing him from saying anything. On the dark nights, as he lay in the cold room, Elian had imagined countless times that he would tell his mother the truth. He wanted her to know that Bartholomew was not the man she thought he was. But every time he tried to speak, Bartholomew would appear, and the way he interrupted Elian always made him fall silent. Bartholomew had a strange ability to make everything seem vague and untrustworthy. making Elian feel as though every word he spoke was meaningless. When Elian finally found an opportunity to tell his mother what Bartholomew had done, Bartholomew would always appear immediately afterward. "What are you thinking, boy?" Bartholomew would sneer, with a look full of mockery. "Your mother will never believe the words of a child like you." Those words were like a sharp blade cutting into Elian's soul, making him feel even more afraid and doubtful of himself. Every time, Elian would feel smaller, unable to stand up for himself. And each time, Bartholomew used his skillful persuasion to make Helen think that Elian was just a jealous child who couldn't accept having a new man in the family. Helen, though sometimes noticing a clear change in Elian, never realized that it was Bartholomew who had caused that change. Every time she looked at her son, she felt something was different. He no longer smiled like before, and his eyes seemed to be filled with sadness and unfamiliarity. But instead of worrying, she began to feel disappointed. "What's going on with you, Elian? Why are you acting this way?" Helen wondered, not understanding that every change in her son was not the result of an effort to adjust, but the consequence of the abuse he had endured. She didn't see what Bartholomew had done behind her back, didn't notice the signs Elian was trying to hide. Every time Elian tried to speak the truth, she thought it was just a normal reaction from a child who couldn't accept the changes in the family. Hurt and misunderstood, Elian withdrew more and more. He didn't dare speak the truth, afraid of being seen as a liar, afraid that his mother wouldn't believe him and would distance herself from him even more. Every time Bartholomew and Helen sat together, laughing and joking, Elian felt like an outsider in his own home. Despite being Helen's son, he felt like he didn't belong, like he couldn't share his feelings and pain with her. One evening, when Elian was sitting alone in his room, his mother walked in and saw him sitting quietly on the bed. "What's wrong, Elian?" Helen asked, her eyes full of concern. But instead of answering, Elian just shook his head. He couldn't speak. He could do nothing but hide the pain in his heart. "Is this how you're going to be from now on?" Helen sighed, clearly disappointed. "Why can't you understand that I only want what's best for you?" Those words were like a knife stabbing into Elian's heart. He just wanted to scream that he had tried, but his mother couldn't see the truth behind his changes. He couldn't keep living this lie, but he also couldn't break the love and trust his mother had for Bartholomew. To protect his mother, Elian didn't dare speak up. He couldn't bear to see her sad, couldn't stand the thought of her leaving if she knew the truth. He understood that his mother loved Bartholomew and couldn't believe him, because she had loved and trusted that man too much. That betrayal, though caused by Bartholomew, made Elian feel alone, with no one to protect him. In the days that followed, he could only quietly endure, holding on to the pain he couldn't share. The relationship between mother and son gradually became fragile. Helen began to doubt Elian, thinking he was a difficult child who couldn't accept the changes in the family. She increasingly misunderstood her son, and Elian, in his pain, became more distant. It wasn't just the suspicion between mother and son, but also Elian's helplessness, as he couldn't do anything to change the situation. He couldn't speak, couldn't tell the truth, and that silence felt like a shackle binding his life. Elian did not give up. Despite the long nights filled with pain and fear, he persisted in trying to make his mother believe the truth. Every time he saw Bartholomew, the tension in his body would rise, but he refused to let himself succumb. He knew he couldn't continue living in the shadow of fear, allowing Bartholomew to manipulate everything. Elian couldn't go on living in a house where every step felt like a battle, where he couldn't feel peace, where he couldn't protect himself. He quietly began collecting evidence. Every time Bartholomew did something wrong, even the smallest actions, Elian would write it down. The bruises on his body were part of the evidence, but he couldn't rely solely on those marks. He needed to find what Bartholomew had done so that Helen could understand. But every time Bartholomew noticed signs of Elian collecting evidence, he would remind him of the consequences if he continued. The constant threats made Elian feel more trapped in his own life. But no, Elian would not give in. He knew that whenever Bartholomew wasn't paying attention, that was his opportunity to execute his plan. Every night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Elian would quietly go outside, seeking help from neighbors or people in the village. However, he understood that it wouldn't be easy to convince anyone. Bartholomew had built a perfect image in the community's eyes, making others believe he was a loving husband and a good father. People looked at them as a happy family, but Elian knew that was just a facade, a huge lie that no one else could see. On days when Bartholomew wasn't home, Elian began looking for opportunities to talk to his mother. He couldn't wait any longer, and the anxiety pushed him to take action. The words he had prepared in his head became difficult when facing his mother. He had tried many times to speak the truth, but every time Bartholomew appeared, all words were cut short. "Don't listen to him, Helen," Bartholomew would often say, his voice calm but threatening. "Elian is just a jealous child. He can't accept change." Those words made Helen more suspicious of Elian than ever. The more she believed in Bartholomew, the more she pushed Elian away. He could only sit in silence, unable to say anything. However, Elian did not give up. He was determined to prove the truth, no matter how difficult it was. One day, when Bartholomew was out, Elian found an opportunity to secretly gather stronger evidence. He found an old journal belonging to Bartholomew, where he had written down thoughts and actions that Elian knew were extremely important. Although it was a risky move, Elian knew this was his only chance to prove that he was not lying. He kept the journal hidden, determined that Bartholomew would never find out. One day when Bartholomew was gone, Elian decided he would face his mother again. He took the journal and handed it to her. Helen took it, but her eyes were still full of doubt. Elian took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Mom, I can't live like this anymore. I can't let Bartholomew do these bad things to me anymore." These words, though soft, were full of power. He knew that if he didn't speak up now, there would be no more chances. His mother looked at the journal, then back at Elian, silent for a long while. Helen began flipping through the pages of the journal, reading Bartholomew's detailed and terrifying writings. With each line, she felt as if she were being hit with a strong shock. The things Elian had endured, the things he had silently endured, now seemed to be exposed before her. A wave of shock spread through Helen's mind, and at that moment, she could not believe what she was reading. Helen looked at Elian, and for the first time in a long time, she saw the pain she had failed to recognize before. Her little boy was not a jealous child. He was not a traitor to the family. He was the victim. Tears began to roll down Helen's face, and at that moment she couldn't stop blaming herself for not seeing the truth sooner. Elian, though feeling a glimmer of hope in his mother's eyes, knew that the road ahead was still long. He couldn't return to a normal life yet, but at least now, the truth had been revealed. And with this resilience, Elian was no longer alone. He would fight to the end to regain his freedom and not let Bartholomew continue destroying his life. Elian had decided he could no longer live in fear. He could no longer silently endure Bartholomew's cruelty. He knew that if he didn't act now, his life would never change. No longer the weak child he once was, Elian had matured in the midst of suffering, and now he carried within him the determination to face the truth. He didn't just want to save himself, but also to free his mother from Bartholomew's manipulation. He decided to return to the village, the place where he had lived his early years, and seek help from the villagers. When he returned to the village, a place that had once been filled with beautiful memories and haunting ones, Elian felt a wave of nostalgia rise within him. The familiar roads, the old houses, all of it reminded him of a time long past. But now, Elian was no longer the fragile child he once was. He was determined to seek support from the people in the village, hoping they would help him expose the truth about Bartholomew. He knew that in order to free himself from the fear and mental shackles, he needed validation from others. He couldn't fight alone. He couldn't rely only on the words of a child who had been ignored for so long. Elian began seeking out old friends, neighbors he had known before his family moved away. He recounted what had happened during his time living with Bartholomew. And gradually, the truth began to unfold. The villagers, though they hadn't seen him in years, couldn't ignore what he had suffered. Elian's account shocked them, and from there, a wave of support began to form. He was no longer alone. While the villagers couldn't do anything immediately, they promised to help him seek justice. However, despite the support from those around him, Elian couldn't escape Bartholomew's control. Every time he thought he had made progress, Bartholomew would appear with his absolute control and dominance. The feeling of being watched, of being overwhelmed, never left Elian. He knew that only when Bartholomew was exposed could his control end. But even with the villagers' support, he knew that his mother, Helen, remained the biggest obstacle in his fight. Because every time he tried to tell her the truth, Bartholomew would always appear at the right moment, creating situations that made Helen doubt Elian. His mother, though she had noticed the changes in Elian, did not understand that it was Bartholomew who had caused those changes. Helen had gradually become tired and skeptical of Elian's actions. Every time he tried to speak, she thought it was just a child's rebellion, and she would turn to Bartholomew, always trusting his words. "You must be misunderstanding," Helen would say, while Bartholomew smiled as if everything were fine. "Bartholomew just wants what's best for us. You can't keep doubting everything like this." Her words were like a knife cutting into Elian's heart. He couldn't say anything more, because he knew his mother wouldn't believe him, even though the truth was right before her eyes. As time passed, Bartholomew's influence over Elian's mother became more evident. Every time Elian tried to reach out to her, she would be drawn into Bartholomew's reasoning, making her more suspicious of Elian than ever. He felt more and more isolated as his efforts went unrecognized. Each time he spoke the truth, each time he wanted her to understand, it would end in disappointment. And then, Elian realized that nothing could change unless the truth was revealed once and for all. He couldn't give up, because he knew that only by doing so could he free himself and his mother. In the days that followed, Elian returned to his resilience. He couldn't let Bartholomew win. He couldn't let things continue as they were. With the support of the villagers, Elian was determined to uncover the truth. He would not let Bartholomew continue to harm him and his family. Though it would be difficult, though he would face challenges, Elian knew that this time, he wasn't just fighting for himself, but for his mother's freedom, so that she no longer had to live under Bartholomew's control. Elian stood in the darkness of the house he had endured for all these years, holding the evidence he had quietly gathered. Each bruise, each mark on his body was not only a physical wound, but also a sign of the emotional pain he had faced, the dark memories that Bartholomew had tried to hide. Today, Elian could remain silent no longer. He could not keep living in fear. He could not let these pains consume his mind. It was time to face the truth. He had spent the entire day preparing for this moment, when the truth would be laid bare for everyone to see. The evidence he had gathered, old wounds, Bartholomew's words that he had written down, were all the clearest proof of what had happened. Elian knew that he could no longer remain silent. He could not let Bartholomew continue to deceive and manipulate not just him, but also his mother. He decided that he would not just face Bartholomew alone, but would expose the truth to the community, to all the people who had always trusted Bartholomew and thought Elian was just a foolish child. Elian stepped out of the house, his heart heavy with a mixture of fear and determination. He knew that this would not be easy, but he also knew there was no other way. Only when the truth was revealed could he escape the nightmare that Bartholomew had forced him into. As he arrived at the village center, where everyone gathered, Elian felt the tension rise within him. The villagers looked at him with curious eyes, not understanding what he was about to do. He stood among the crowd, holding the evidence tightly in his hands, staring directly at Bartholomew, the man he had once called father. Bartholomew, as usual, smiled insincerely and walked toward Elian, as if nothing had happened, as if everything was fine. But today, Elian was no longer the weak, silent child who had endured in silence. He stood firm, no longer allowing fear to control him. "This is the truth, Bartholomew," Elian spoke, his voice resonating in the air, drawing the attention of everyone around him. The villagers began to look at him, their eyes wide with surprise. Elian opened the journal, revealing undeniable evidence of the brutal actions that Bartholomew had taken. The words in the journal, the old photos, and the evidence he had collected over time all revealed the truth that Bartholomew had intentionally kept hidden. Bartholomew tried to maintain his composure, but Elian could clearly see the tension in his body. "You can't do this, Elian," Bartholomew said, his voice filled with anger and confusion. "What are you doing? You don't understand." But Elian refused to be swayed. He stood there, never taking his eyes off Bartholomew, not backing down. The people around them began to murmur, their gazes filled with shock and fear directed at Bartholomew. They couldn't believe what they had just heard. Bartholomew, the man they had always seen as a good man, was now revealed to be a monster, the one who had tormented a child for so many years. The villagers began to realize the truth that Elian had endured. Their gazes shifted to sympathy, and criticisms began to be voiced. Elian did not feel joy or satisfaction from this. He only felt a little relief, because finally, the truth had been exposed. He no longer had to live in torment, no longer had to fear Bartholomew's presence. But that feeling wasn't enough to erase the pain he had carried for so long. The villagers began to approach Elian, looking at the evidence, and then turning to Bartholomew with anger in their eyes. Bartholomew, though trying to remain calm, couldn't hide the fear spreading in his eyes. The criticism and condemnation started pouring down, and eventually, Bartholomew could not take it anymore. He turned and walked away, without saying a word, while Elian stood there, no longer afraid. At this moment, Elian knew that his life would never be the same again. He had exposed the truth, had faced Bartholomew, and now the change had begun. Although this was not over, at least he no longer had to live in the dark. He was no longer a weak child, but a strong man, brave enough to stand up for himself and the truth. The day Elian had been waiting for all these years had finally come. Bartholomew, the man he had once called father, the man he had lived in fear and oppression under for so many years, now had to face the truth that Elian had made public. Throughout that long time, Bartholomew had done everything to conceal his true nature, using deception and control to keep himself safe from society's and the law's scrutiny. But today, there was no protection for him. The evidence Elian had gathered, the times Bartholomew couldn't deny, had finally brought him to the day of reckoning. The police, after receiving enough evidence from Elian and the villagers, arrived at the house where Bartholomew had lived. The signs of fear and tension were evident on Bartholomew's face as he saw the police cars stop in front of the gate. He stood still for a moment, not believing what was happening. Everything seemed to be falling apart before his eyes, and there was no way out. Bartholomew began to sweat coldly, but instead of surrendering, he tried to maintain his composure. "Everything you say is a lie," he shouted, glaring at Elian with anger. "You have no right to do this. Your mother will never believe these lies." Elian looked at Bartholomew, no longer afraid, no longer the child he could manipulate. He had endured too much pain and fear to go back to being a weak child. He had stood up, fought, and now, facing Bartholomew, he no longer felt small or helpless. "It's time for you to face what you've done," Elian said, his voice firm, without trembling. "No one can protect you anymore." The police entered, the officers Elian had contacted beforehand, with undeniable evidence. Everything Bartholomew had done was proven by the wounds, the documents, and the testimonies from those who had witnessed his brutality. The villagers, the ones Bartholomew had always deceived, now stood by Elian, unable to deny the truth they had seen. Bartholomew tried to deny it, but he couldn't. The police had gathered enough evidence, and in the end, he was arrested. The clear clues, the injuries Elian had suffered, and the villagers' testimonies made all of Bartholomew's justifications meaningless. In one moment, he realized that the years of hiding were over, and he could no longer deceive anyone. Elian stood there, no longer feeling fear or anxiety. He felt as though he had emerged from a long nightmare. At that moment, he was no longer the weak child, no longer the boy oppressed and abused in silence. He was a strong man, one who had bravely stood up to defend the truth and take back control of his life. He looked at Bartholomew, the man he had once called father, now bound, with no power left. And in that moment, Elian felt the release. No more fear, no more darkness from the years of suffering. Elian's mother, Helen, stood beside him, and this time, her gaze held no doubt. She looked at Bartholomew, no longer seeing the man she had once thought of as a loving husband. Instead, she saw a sinner, a man who had deceived and hurt the child she had always loved. Tears streamed down her face as she finally realized how blind she had been, how she had missed the signs over the years. Though she couldn't change the past, she knew that this was the time to make things right, to support her son, and to face the future with him. The police escorted Bartholomew out, and Elian stood there with no regret or confusion. All he felt was peace, a sense that the burdens had been lifted. Yes, the struggle wasn't over, but today, Elian had won. He had faced his fears, stood up for the truth, and would not let Bartholomew continue to control his life. As Bartholomew was led away, Elian looked at his mother. He didn't need to say anything more, because she understood. Helen no longer doubted him, no longer saw him as a jealous child. He had done what she couldn't, freed himself from the abuse, and not allowed the ghosts of the past to haunt his future. Elian didn't look back. He knew that stepping out of that nightmare was the only thing that needed to be done. The truth had been revealed, and from this day forward, he would never be a victim again. He would live freely, strongly, and not let the past dictate his future. As Bartholomew was led away, Elian stood silently, watching him go, feeling a deep sense of liberation. After all the years of living in fear and suffocation, he had finally found freedom. The wounds, not just on his body, but also in his soul, began to heal as he saw Bartholomew arrested, facing his own guilt. Everything he had endured, every pain and fear, was finally exposed. Elian felt as if a massive burden had been lifted from his shoulders, but the joy was incomplete. He knew that he still had to face what was left, with Helen, who had not believed him all these years. His mother, the one Elian had always loved, now stood before him, her eyes filled with tears. She said nothing, only standing there, looking at her son, and in her eyes, there was deep regret. Elian understood that she had trusted Bartholomew too much, had been blind to the signs of the suffering he had endured. But no matter how much she regretted it, Elian could not forget the years of living in silence, when she had always doubted him and never truly trusted him. His words had been dismissed, the truths covered up by Bartholomew's lies. He had lived in that loneliness, when his mother, the one he trusted most, could not stand by him. Elian stood before his mother, feeling empty but also strong. He knew he could not live in the past forever, no matter how deep those wounds were. He had fought for freedom, to find peace in his heart, and now it was time for him to move on with his life, not letting the past control his future. "Mom," Elian spoke, his voice steady, not trembling but resolute. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. I couldn't live in this paralysis forever. I need to move on, even if you can't fully understand what I've gone through. Helen looked at Elian, her eyes full of sorrow. She understood that his words were the truth, but she didn't know how to make up for the mistakes she had made. How many times had she failed to see the obvious signs of abuse? How many times had she ignored her son's pleas simply because she trusted a man she thought would be a good father to her son? Helen felt her heart being torn apart. She couldn't change the past, but she knew she could change the future. Yet, Elian no longer wanted to wait for her. He had endured enough, and now it was time for him to rebuild his life. He turned and walked away, each step a decision that could not be undone. Elian didn't look back. He no longer needed to wait for forgiveness from his mother or from Bartholomew. Forgiveness was already in his heart, but that didn't mean he would forget what had happened. He had forgiven not only Bartholomew, but also himself. He couldn't keep living in the darkness of the past, so he decided to leave and start a new life, a life free from the painful memories that had haunted him. Elian left without any expectation. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to face any challenge. It was a choice, a decision not to remain confined by the wounds of the past. He would not let the past control him anymore. He would live the life he deserved, a life without fear, without silence and pain. And even though there were scars that could never be erased, Elian had learned how to rise and keep moving forward with strength and resilience. That day, when Elian walked away from the house he had once called home, he was no longer the weak child Bartholomew had controlled. He was a man, stronger than ever, and forgiveness was not just for others, but for himself. Elian walked in the light of a new future, no longer haunted by the past, and never looking back. And so, Elian's story did not end in suffering, but in a new beginning, a fresh start of a life filled with freedom and peace. He had found his liberation in forgiveness and refused to let the bad memories control his life any longer. Elian had chosen to live for the present and the future, not because the past was forgiven, but because he had found strength within himself.